Hey, it's Kat and I'm back because what once was will begin at least until Daenerys finishes breaking the will. And as usual, we're going to use history, maybe some mythology, and no astrology this time though, to define the mysteries of the Game of Thrones. And we're going to continue on the subject of what's in a name and who are people in history. And particularly this one, we're going to focus on the Tyrells, because the Tyrells actually have a super important part to play in the history of the War of Roses, which is the backdrop for our story of A Game of Thrones. First, we should keep in mind, as usual, that when Mr. Martin has used this for a backdrop for his story, he hasn't actually presented it in a linear fashion, nor has he given specific characters to be just one character in history, but he's mixed and matched it. He's made events happen in different time frames and in different places to different people, including across different genders. So he's not been so specific that you could just point to somebody and say, oh, that's who they are in history and this is what's going to happen to them. He likes to mix it up, and that sometimes they play the part and then later they're playing somebody else. So one of the people that we talked about very recently in the video regarding the White Rose and the Sun and Splendor was Olenna Tyrell. And in that video, I talked about how the Tyrells symbol was a white rose, which is very much the Yorks, and that she's now down in Dorne making some sort of agreement with the Dornish, and their symbol is the Sun and Splendor, and that in fact that the white rose superimposed on the Sun and Splendor was a Yorkist badge. And in fact, it was used by Edward IV, Richard III, as well as eventually Elizabeth of York, whom I've said in another video is nominally our friend Daenerys Targaryen. In fact, it was used to such a degree in Elizabeth of York's coronation pageant that it almost just tells you right there who's going to be whom in this storyline. But we really have to wait. Like I said, Mr. Martin likes to mix it up. That in Elizabeth of York's coronation, it wasn't just on flags or presented as symbols around her to represent her idea that she was in fact the Yorkist princess who was marrying Henry Tudor, marrying the two lines together, the Lancasters and the Yorks. But it was actually embroidered on her gown. Like they had a gown especially made of cloth of gold, and it was woven specifically with this symbol all over it. So maybe that's going to tell us something else in our story. But let's go back and talk about Olenna Tyrell in particular. And I said that she was essentially Cecily Neville, who was the Duchess of York, who was in history called Proud Cis. And we have Olenna Tyrell being called the Queen of Thorns, which is really an excellent epitaph for Cecily Neville, the Duchess of York. That was exactly who she was. And in fact, we see Olenna Tyrell not only acting in that part, but literally dressing in that part with her clothes with the roses all over it. So this is one part that Cecily Neville is playing. Olenna Tyrell, although she's also at this moment playing a piece of Margaret Beaufort as well as Elizabeth Woodville, which is a really interesting amalgamation. But we also know that Olenna Tyrell did something else in our storyline, and that is that she conspired in the murder of Joffrey. So we're going to talk about what that is in history and who the Tyrells were really in history and how that works out in the storyline. Okay, so in our storyline, Joffrey Baratheon, quote unquote, and his brother Tommen are essentially the two sons and heirs of Robert Baratheon. Although we know in our story it turns out that they are actually illegitimate children of Cersei and her brother Jaime, which is interesting in history. We're going to talk about that. But Robert Baratheon was basically playing the part of Edward IV. Historically, Edward IV was the one who deposed the Mad King Henry VI, which in our storyline is Aerys II, the Mad King. And when he took the throne, people cheered him. They thought he was going to be the best king possible because, of course, Aerys II was crazy, just as Henry VI was. And just like Robert Baratheon, Edward IV, in his younger years when he took the throne, was good-looking, charismatic. He was a natural leader of men, and he was an excellent strategist and tactician, which allowed him to beat the Lancastrians several times and not only take the throne but maintain it. But eventually, just like Robert Baratheon, as he aged and there were no more real rebellions to put down or no real wars for him to go fight, he subsided into drinking and eating, binge eating, and wenching, and producing a lot of illegitimate children to go along with his multiple children he had with Elizabeth Woodville. And in the story of A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, we see that Robert Baratheon gets gored by a boar right in his guts. But what really happened to Edward IV was he did end up having some sort of gut ailment that eventually killed him, probably because he was eating and drinking too much. He may have eaten some bad food, gotten a severe case of food poisoning, and believe me, in those days, there are so many diseases or simple illnesses that we just take care of with something over the counter. That just didn't happen back then. You could die. Okay, but it's really symbolic how he was gored by a boar, because this is really sort of the idea of what happens in history, because after Edward IV died, his brother, Richard III, Duke of Gloucester, his symbol was actually a silver or white boar on his flag, along with the Yorkist symbol. And if you know what happened, that Richard III is essentially accused of killing Edward IV's heirs and taking the throne, which really is symbolic of actually goring his brother's dynasty. Now, of course, we see that Cersei has taken the throne after the two princes in the tower are now dead. And she is, in some ways, Richard III, where we see that she has no more allies in court. And that's exactly what happened to Richard III. Almost as soon as he took the crown, his allies began to drift away. Our story, as Robert Baratheon lay dying, he made out his final will, and he made Ned Stark not only his hand, but now the protector of the realm, is supposed to oversee and protect his two sons. And then he died. In a similar fashion, Edward IV, as he lay dying, supposedly made out a new will, or a codicil thereof, which said that his brother Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, would now be the protector of the realm, and that he would have the guardianship of his two sons. Edward, later Edward V, though for a very short period of time, and Richard, Duke of York. In our story, Ned discovers that the children are in fact illegitimate, and he confronts Cersei with this information and tells her she needs to flee now so that Robert doesn't end up killing them or something else doesn't happen. But Cersei ends up working around Ned and gets him killed, and he never actually declares that they're illegitimate. In history, though, Richard III, once he took his two nephews into his custody and put the princes in the tower, he very quickly had a parliament called in which the children were declared to be illegitimate based on some sort of previous arrangement or marriage that Edward IV supposedly had with another woman. And then we see that they disappear into history, and Richard III has himself crowned. The things that Mr. Martin likes to do, along with mixing and matching his history, is play a little game of what if. So what if the heirs had not been locked in the tower and or proclaimed illegitimate, but being super young heirs, they came to the throne? What happens next? Well, in history, what happens next with super young heirs is that there's a lot of infighting and political moves in order to try to take control of the heirs. And this is something that we see happening here. First with Joffrey, who isn't very good at taking advice. And then later with Tommen, who is totally overruled by everybody. And this has happened several times in English history. And then in our storyline, the first thing that happens is that Olenna Tyrell conspires to murder Joffrey. And then after Tommen takes the throne, he ends up dying. So very much the princes in the tower in some respects, but in the what if kind of way. But the fact that Olenna Tyrell took part in the murders is super interesting and should draw our attention. Because according to history, it is one Sir James Tyrell who confesses at a later date to being part of or the instigator of the murders of the princes in the Tower at the orders of Richard III. According to Sir Thomas More, who wrote an incompleted history of Richard III, Sir James Tyrell, almost 20 years after the fact, having been attainted a traitor for something else entirely, actually confesses to the murder. And he says that not only did Richard III order him, but then he buried the prince's bodies at the bottom of a stairwell inside the Tower. Now, which one, apparently nobody knows. So maybe Sir James Tyrell wasn't there for the actual burying. He just knew that that's what was going to happen. And he claims later that the Richard III said that he had the bodies moved to a more fitting burial place fit for the sons of his brother Edward IV. Storyline: Joffrey was buried in the steppes along with his grandfather Tywin and his sister Myrcella. Cersei blew it up and pretty much blew everything to Kingdom Come, as well as ashes to ashes. And when Tommen ends up killing himself, she orders his body to be cremated and then the ashes thrown into the sept so that he can be with his grandfather and his brother and sister. And this is very much sort of symbolic of history, so you'll never find his body, which you will never find the bodies of the princes in the Tower, they kind of did, but nobody's ever been able to really examine them in a modern way in which would actually validate 100% for sure that those are the bodies. So it remains a mystery, just like in our story. Interesting parallels here is, of course, after Joffrey dies, it's not Olenna Tyrell who's fingered for the murder, but Cersei points to her youngest brother, Tyrion Lannister, as the doer of the deeds. And he is brought to trial despite his declarations of innocence. Now, interestingly enough, during his trial, he gives this very interesting speech in which he talks about how he's a dwarf and he's malformed and he has these scars and he looks like a monster. Therefore, everybody accuses him of being a monster, and he probably just should have acted like the monster he's being accused of being, which is, in some retrospect, sort of a defense of Richard III, who is been called or has been referred to as a hunchback in history. The first one writing of this was actually Shakespeare, almost 100 years after the fact, in his story Richard III, in which he presents him as a monstrous, malformed person, and he acts very monstrously. And most people have thought, historically speaking and analytically in terms of a play, that this is how you present the evil, is you present it as malformed and ugly. And people thought that anybody who was malformed was in fact some sort of product of evil or the devil. And so for a long time, people have thought this has simply been some sort of propaganda or a theatrical allegory in order to present the persona of Richard III. Interestingly enough, of course, recently when they actually uncovered the burial place of Richard III, they discovered that he in fact was a hunchback. That he had scoliosis with a very defined curved spine and possibly a very raised shoulder. Did that make Richard III a monster? We don't know. And we're not here to argue that. We're just talking about how Mr. Martin has used this in his story to flesh out his Song of Ice and Fire. And in fact, this storyline actually occurs several times throughout the story. And we're going to talk about a couple more of those as we go along. So this is just one aspect of the Princess in the Tower. And that Sir James Tyrell, the Tyrells, was involved historically with those murders, just like we see Olenna Tyrell. And just like Olenna Tyrell, James Tyrell probably had his own personal reasons for participating in that murder, since it was Edward IV, the two princes' father, who had his father beheaded on the Tower Hill after the Battle of Towton. So there you go. There's the Tyrells. Historically, the Tyrells have been involved with the murder of the heirs to the thrones. We're going to come back and talk about Princes in the Tower some more, because there's so many different times this appears. Thank you very much. Hit the like button. Tell me what you think. Do I think Olenna Tyrell's getting beheaded? No, because she's also Cecily Neville.